Hi, this is Paul. I just made a tiny little short video because I wanted to make a short video with a thumbnail about that point that as I watch like Stories of Old, Cultural Drinker, Damon Walker's science fiction, Paul Antleitner does this too. And if you go to Paul Antleitner's channel, you can see if you look, for example, at his videos, the videos where he does most of the kind of stuff we do, compared to, let's say, the popularity, his most popular movie, 300,000 views for Godzilla minus one, Snyder Cut Batman versus Superman. In other words, when he does the work of, say, using these Hollywood images, they really go because that connects with our culture. Other conversations, not so much. And there was just seeing the discrepancy and watching how the barrage of the iconography of our cultural temples impacted me. I sort of felt the dissonance and the responses. Now, I watched the Shapiro. This is a I don't know. I sometimes just do not understand who thought that this. I'm gonna save this one. I do not know who thought that this particular setup looked good. it looks funny, and I don't know why it looks funny. There's nothing wrong with it. And in fact, the monitor that's over here to the left of me, it's a big monitor. And so it would look weird if I had a camera sort of at the side and you saw me on my monitor and I'd, do a Zoom call with someone through it. So again, there's nothing wrong with it. I'm not criticizing anyone, but we're in this weird space. Now, I thought a lot about this when I was thinking about, for example, let's see if I can find the space where Jonathan talks about the story, where Jonathan basically does this thing, sort of walking us through, taking stuff that's below the waterline and bringing it up into our conscious minds. Okay, so here Jonathan is going to explain the Jack and the Beanstalk story to us.
Through kind of your analysis of one of these fairy tales. So pick one of the fairy tales that you like the best and give us sort of the deep read on it.
We could pick Jack. I think Jack is a good example because also we're just publishing the newest version. And Jack's fun because the thing about Jack is at the outset it looks ridiculous. Like it's really difficult to see what the connection. Since I was a child, I love that story, but I was always wondering like how do we get from these different parts of the story to the others, right? But it's actually once you kind of understand it, it's actually it's deeply coherent. And so like a lot of the stories, Jack is a coming of age story at the outset, right? This is also the thing that's difficult about a lot of Puritan interpretation of fairy tales, is they try to get rid of the coming of age and sometimes sexual imagery that's in the fairy tale. By doing that, they miss a whole part of it. Now, the other part, like the more progressive types, let's say in the 20th century, have tried to emphasize just sexuality. But that's also wrong. It's both. Just like in the Bible, there's a bunch of sexual symbolism. But it's not just about sex. It's about how sexuality can show us a deeper meaning and a deeper participation. So you see that in Jack. So basically, Jack doesn't have a father, and his mother's poor. Right, and so she's the poor woman. She's the widow in the story of Elijah. She's someone who doesn't have anything coming from heaven, to give her an identity and to hold her together. And so Jack has to trade the cow. He has to trade the feminine for seed, and it happens about at the time that he's at that age where that's going to happen to him, where he's going to kind of leave his mother. His body's going to develop. He's going to discover masculinity, but it's magic seed. But seeds are magic in themselves. Like they don't even have to be magic seeds. They're the difference between a cow that gives you milk and seed that you can plant in the ground, and then they give you a whole bunch of food forever if you're able to do it right. So that's what's going on in that story. He plants the seeds at night and he wakes up with a giant beanstalk. There is a little bit of a sexual illusion there about him discovering masculinity. He climbs the beanstalk and then he encounters a giant. And so in encountering the giant, he basically encounters the problem of masculinity, the problem of hierarchy, the idea of trying to integrate a world of masculinity when you're coming of age. Anybody knows that. You have to when you try to join a team or you have to do anything, you have to prove yourself, and the other men are giants to you, right? But he has a problem. His mother's poor, and that's one of the problems that he's trying to deal with, the poor mother. And so he finds a bag of gold. He steals that from the giant, brings it to his mother. You think the problem's solved, right? He found a bag of gold, solved the problem, but then the gold runs out. So what's better than gold, right? What's better than gold is the way you make gold. If you can produce gold, then it's much better than gold. So he goes back up and he gets a chicken that lays golden eggs. He's reached a higher level of understanding, like a higher pattern of masculinity, a higher pattern of civilization, just a higher pattern of how the world functions. Brings that down to his mother. But again, that's not enough, it seems. He has to find something else. And then when he goes back up, the last thing he finds is a golden harp that plays music. So you think, what the hell? Like, what is the relationship between the gold, the chicken that lays gold down, and the harp? But it's once you understand that what he's getting from heaven is something like patterns. He's getting patterns of being. So you think of Moses that goes up the mountain, right? What does he get when he gets to the top? He gets at the top. He gets a pattern of being. That's what the law is. He gets a pattern of space. That's what the pattern of the tabernacle is. And so this is what he's getting. He's getting patterns of being. And now he gets the highest pattern. For all intents and purposes, he gets what we call the music of the spheres. Basically, the pattern of everything is what he's attaining, right? The logos itself, if you want to use another type of language. And so he steals that from his mother, and then he comes back down, and then he cuts the beanstalk, and the beanstalk falls. And so now he's gotten from heaven, but it's a weird Promethean story. It's actually a little suspicious because he's stealing these things from heaven. So there's something of a Promethean element to what he's doing, which is he's going into up Mount Olympus and he's stealing the fire from the gods and bringing them to earth. And so this is once you kind of understand it, you can see that it's totally coherent. It makes sense with a lot of the Bible stories. It makes sense with the ancient myths. And that it's a gray story, actually, because Jack is a thief who goes into heaven to steal knowledge from the gods, basically. And so in our version, what we do is I play with that, where I reference the idea of the fallen angels and the fallen giants, and this idea that in some ways there's something suspicious about what he's doing, although we all tend to do that, but there's something suspicious about it.
I mean, one of the things that's fascinating about what you're doing in re-examining.
Okay, so I love it when Jonathan does this because I've heard versions of Jack and the Beanstalk for a very long time, although probably almost all of the versions that I've heard of that fairy tale have been retold in a particular way, usually probably by people who just engage it at the story level and don't go any deeper. Now, a little bit later in this video, there's a really nice point when Ben Shapiro is talking about sort of what Hollywood movies have done, and Jonathan Peugeot makes the point that Disney has fallen so far because it seems that the Disney writers don't understand the stories they're attempting to recast.
These fairy tales, it demonstrates how they can also be emptied of all meaning. So you mentioned that the early Disney fairy tales are replete with tremendous darkness. I mean, if you watch the original Snow White from Disney, it is incredibly dark. I mean, if you show it to your kids, this was rated G. People were scared in the theaters. Kids were crying. Like, it's a real thing. And now, because we basically have said that children should never experience anything that scares them or that upsets them, many parents will never show their kid.
And this then gets into the video I made for today, which was yesterday for when you're seeing this, where I thought Nina Power and Alex Kashuda, if I'm saying her name correctly, really made the point well that we're now such a trauma-phobic culture. There's so much safetyism that we're trying to prevent. There's sort of a proximal development issue with you need just enough difficulty so that you can grow. Too much difficulty in the wrong way, and it impairs you. And often the growing and the impairing come together. But at least rated G Disney stories understood that kids, in fact, they want to be scared to a degree. They want to be scared safely. They need to sort of rehearse and practice this, a lot of these things. And Jordan Peterson, in his classroom lectures, I thought really talked about this nicely. Of course, he talked about Pinocchio. And what these stories do for kids is sort of give them, it's almost a, boy, if I say the word, it's what they used to do for those shots that you used to get to prevent you from getting an illness, where they'd give you a crippled version of the virus. And that then would help you fight off, or, even with smallpox, they used to do that. They used to, try to give the person a small infection so that the body could code to that virus so that it could fight off the real virus when it came to them. That's basically the idea behind it. And we had this in our culture.
Anything like the old Disney movies. The old Disney movies, again, if you watch Pinocchio is scary as hell. I mean, truly, it is frightening. I mean, there are children turning into donkeys and being caged forever. I mean, it's really, really scary. And then you fast forward to kind of the fairy tales as they're retold today, and now it's all kind of the same theme. It's always some young girl who is becoming self-empowered and never really has to face a villain. It turns out there really isn't a villain. There's just somebody who's sort of misunderstood.
Yeah, that's right.
And then eventually everybody, it all comes out right in the end because she's found her inner sense of confidence, and then the world is somehow a better place.
The secret sacred self.
And that's the story of pretty much every single one of the Disney fairy tales for the last 10 years. So you can see the transition in American life.
And my question is, okay, these things are below the waterline, below the consciousness waterline for us, and they are impacting us. They are molding us. We are seeing the world through them. Sisyphus 55 just put out a video on mental health, and where it goes is basically where the conversation is going, and you can see it through Vervaeke, you can see it through Peterson. There's always this big delay in terms of the popular level with respect to many of these issues and sort of where the elites are at. And the elites have now, well, he says it nicely at the beginning of this video.
We are the ones responsible for our own unhappiness. To a certain degree, this is true. Seeking mental health support, as well as making adjustments in our lifestyles, are surefire ways to tackle issues such as depression and anxiety. However, this mindset can be taken too far. Mark Fisher uses the term magical voluntarism to describe the sort of socially endorsed belief that we are fundamentally responsible for how we experience our lives. The popularity of magical voluntarism is evident in the thousands of self-help books that are published every year that ask us to take full responsibility for our mental health. But this is a limited view. Our mental health is just as informed by our environments as by our own choices. Mental disorders are more than just broken brains. They also involve the world and our relationship with it. This is perhaps best understood through the field of phenomenological psychopathology. Here to help introduce this is Mistyverse, a philosophy YouTuber who is currently writing a PhD thesis on autism, phenomenology, and cognitive science.
The dominant biomedical approach of modern psychiatry views mental disorders as similar to physical diseases, with biological causes that can be discovered, diagnosed, and treated. This has led to a restricted focus on brain function as the primary basis of mental disorders. If one wants to explain depression, for example, one need only look at the differences in the fluctuations of neurotransmitters and neuromodulators, and prescribe the relevant drugs to make them more normal. However, the biomedical approach can't explain all aspects of mental disorders. In particular, it neglects to account for lived experience. After all, it's not a broken brain that comes to the clinic in need of help, but rather a suffering person. In the field known as phenomenological psychopathology, there's more to mental disorders than brain function. Instead, the focus is shifted toward the complex dynamics between the brain, the body, and the wider environment in which the embodied organism is embedded.
And of course, anybody who's been following this conversation, okay, it's transjective. It's a transjective situation. Telemarketers. Ugh. This was on Luke's live stream this morning.
I'm sorry. Very soon, I'm going to be talking about Macbeth as a Christian play on Jacob's channel.
And I just have to say that if you go back and you look at one of my conversations with Richard Roll, and he basically said, did he say it in the conversation or did he say it to me privately? I don't remember. He predicts that the corner is going to lose their mind over Shakespeare in a good way. He's going to be, once we discover Shakespeare, it's going to be, the corner is just going to be, totally colonized by Shakespeare. So here's David doing getting us started, perhaps.
Nice.
Where I believe that play is deeply Christian, and the play ends with a lot of things that get quoted by existentialists. Like a ton of existentialists will quote. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. That becomes even the sound and the fury becomes like these are contemplations that people have about what life amounts to, but people forget that Macbeth's perspective is actually shaped by the fact that he pushes away from God. He participates in an action which he believes is evil, and he thinks he can keep himself, that he can keep his perspective and still do what's evil. His wife feels that way too. She's like, oh, it's fine. We just do this thing, man up and do the action. But then they both lose their minds. She goes crazy and ultimately kills herself. He loses even the ability to be afraid. He says by the end of the play, it has been so long since I have been afeared. Like he can't, if he cuts, like it's, what's it called? Crime and Punishment as well. You do the action, you throw yourself into this world, and then you don't get to keep yourself.
And nobody talks, poor David. But he goes on to make the point that the movie Norseman, which I haven't seen, it's Norseman or Northman, he said that's basically pagan Macbeth. They've sort of moved the underpinning. So again, we have this question of, okay, so you've got Jack and the Beanstalk. How did that form a culture? And of course, Ben Shapiro asked the question about magic in that conversation. And one of the things that going over to Europe was super helpful with was when you would see, we first started in Italy, in Naples, where we visited Pompeii and the Naples Museum of Archaeology, where you go into these houses and the iconostasis of these houses were all taken from the mythological religions of the surrounding country, of the Mediterranean. And again, it was really weird in Pompeii where you have Isis in the Mediterranean. It's like, what's this Egyptian god doing here? And you had all these crocodile motifs on the walls, and it's like, they said, well, that was the fashion at that moment. The Romans had discovered some of these things from Egypt, and they said, oh, look, this is cool. Well, why did they think it was cool? Again, now we're getting into the mythology, all of the questions of the subconscious and why certain images appeal to us when our conscious mind doesn't know. We have basically the above the waterline and the below the waterline, and we're wrestling with these questions. Now, I just don't have enough time. Not that one. Not that one. Last night I watched a bunch of no, not that one. Oh, where is it? I watched a bunch of like stories of old. I'd mentioned before, This Worst Is Yet to Come. Really a profound piece. It's been fascinating watching him wrestle with questions of existence as he's doing it through the movies. And I think a lot of his videos, I think they're really amazing. But again, you can feel the iconostasis effect in these videos.
Excesses, the long, slow exile from the sacred into the profane, the disenchantment of the world, was set in motion. As intellectualism suppressed belief in magic, Max Weber explained, the world's processes become disenchanted, losing the magical significance, and henceforth simply are and happen. but no longer signify anything. On this note, Emmanuel Levinas added, "The contemporary world, scientific, technical, and sensualist, sees itself without exit, that is, without God. Not because everything there is permitted and, by way of technology, possible, but because everything there is equal. The unknown is immediately made familiar. This is the profane experience. There is no stone that is more meaningful than the next. There's no cosmic tree connecting us to a reality beyond, no force to connect and guide us."
Right there. In just a little while, using the iconostasis of Hollywood very effectively communicates Vervaeke's meaning crisis.
It's all just plain matter and indifferent movement. Without sacred boundaries, everything is permitted. Every tree can be cut, every stone can be lifted. At first, a liberating thought. No more dogmas, no more limitations, only the light of reason and the fire of creative passion. A bird's eye view captures the grand metamorphosis, mankind itself becoming sorcerer, infusing matter with its own magic to unlock greater powers, manifesting its own dreams so that it can dream bigger. But no matter how exceptional the accomplishment, no matter how great the wonder, something essential is missing, something essential has been broken. Koyaanisqatsi, life out of balance, a false paradise, a mirage. For in the end, we know the sorcerer to be but a stage magician, and we know the magic to be but an illusion.
The audience knows the truth. The world is simple. It's miserable. Solid all the way through.
So many horror movies end up slightly disappointing in the third act, when, after titillating us with the ambiguity of the occult, the mysterious phenomenon turns out to be an actual manifestation of magic, be it some evil spirit or demon. It marks the end of our suspension of disbelief, and the breaking of the promise for a revelation that is somehow more clever. For the disenchanted viewer cannot be wholly satisfied by the supernatural, by that which no longer has any intrinsic value to it beyond being a cheap storyteller's cop-out. But the profane resolution too often leaves a bittersweet aftertaste once the twist is revealed, or the central puzzle completed. We enjoy looking for the secret, but we don't really want to know. We want to be fooled, to remain suspended in the in-between, in the captivation before disillusionment.
And again, if you are conversant in the canonical stories that he has just flashed up the icons for, well, you're watching it above the waterline, but below the waterline, you feel things move. Because it's the feelings that basically let us know what's happening below the waterline, and it's all the words and the propositions that are happening above the waterline. And as a preacher, I look at this and I think, to a world immersed in screens who have watched everything and seen everything, it is awfully difficult to compete. And really, the only way to compete is to get people away from the screens and into reality. Last week I made a video, you're going to need face-to-face community to contend with AI. Because of course, I can right now at this point, I can have Notebook LLM create a NPR-like podcast, giving you a 8-minute version of a Randos conversation, hitting all the little points, or all the little points for any video that's out there. But we've seen the power that we're wielding in terms of the waterline, and I don't know that. Well, then again, I don't know that we've seen it because, well, I don't know. Now, I watched how modern audiences are failing cinema. Another
for one person
another really tremendous. He goes through the literally me, where people are watching these movies and identification, and now that's the only thing that they're tuning in for is, oh, I see myself in the movie, and so then the boundaries are brought down, and we go back and forth. We get to go through the iconostasis onto the altar, and of course, in our modern parlance, we are the God at the center of the story. And then he goes into the self-righteous moralism, and he, basically writes off the anti-woke as reactionary. But then he faces that, in fact, the point of the anti-woke has been, well, wait a minute. So much of the stuff is just devolving into self-righteous moralism. And then he goes into the overwhelming constant stimulants, how we're just in the screens all the time, escaping. And then he gets to, well, true nourishment, which is when the art actually works. But of course, he's talked earlier in the video about the fact that it is in fact transjective. You have to go into the art. You have to read Macbeth. You have to grapple with it. You can't let the LLM take you, or you can't let the grifter or the person who's looking to colonize you just have you, or they will definitely turn you into sheeple. Got a Randos conversation coming up. Don't know if I'll have time to finish this after. So this might be the end of it, might not be the end of it. We'll see. I actually decided to take down the little video I made. It was too little. And the more I made this video, the more I thought, well, maybe I'll use the title of that little video in the big video. Thomas Flight has a very interesting movie about continuity and jump cuts. And this gets into, and what's fun is that he plays with it. Look at his hair now. He plays with the whole thing as he talks about it. He puts different pictures up and back. He moves them around. So he's playing with the idea as he goes, and then when he gets closer to the end, come on. Then, things are more or less restored. 100 years ago in the Christian Reformed Church, a high-status minister who was teaching at the seminary basically was kicked out because he couldn't stop going to the theater. And he was probably seeing both plays and movies, and he couldn't kick the habit, and so he was no longer allowed to teach. One of the hopes given is to tell better stories, and I'm super interested and supportive of Jonathan's work of reworking the fairy tales, because, well, we've never stopped reworking the fairy tales. We've never stopped reworking all of this image creation. And as I talked about the iconostasis, this veil, part of what I thought, Thomas van der Linde, he's the guy that does like stories of old. His name is right there on there. I'm not giving out any information, if I've got his name right, in fact. Part of what he points to is that there's always a veiling and a seeing, a veiling and a seeing. And I think in many ways this is part of the service that Peugeot is doing with his capacity to understand the story and be able to reformat the story in an above the waterline propositional way. It is a deep irony that in all of the efforts at combating propositional tyranny, so much of what we do is we take that which is symbolic, that which is covered, that which is unseen, and we do our best to make it seen. And so we're always playing with this iconostasis. We're always playing with this veil. And in many ways, the mental illness question is one of just how far the parameters are. And when I say that, I don't mean that as a relativist. One of the academic agent just topping to the left, woke right, James Lindsay is mental. Wow. This from Damon Walter.
Called Joker, a movie about madness and civilization. Madness is the false punishment of a false solution, but by its own virtue it brings to light the real problem, which can then be truly resolved. Madness and Civilization by Michel Foucault is a history of how our society treats the insane. Foucault argues that madness and insanity are categories imposed by society on those at the bottom of society, in an act we now commonly call othering.
And I think that's a terrible definition. And I'm amazed someone would make it as if there isn't a standard. That's, I guess, just the point. If there is no standard, then anything is as valid as any other thing. But when you look at patterns of behavior and patterns of belief and patterns of, basically, if you get to this point, once there is no flourishing, there can also be no othering. Because the ways that society oppresses isn't really oppressing. It's just another thing. Everything is just another thing. And so when Peugeot sort of takes apart Jack and the Beanstalk and begins to notice that, wow, this has a lot to do with maturation of a young man, that his seed is magical, and that he exchanges the cow for, of course, for most of us, we're just thinking cow. And of course, Peugeot, I think, nicely talks about that. What we all deal with is sort of a dead reckoning. We have intuitive sense, sometimes right, sometimes wrong, that I think about Jordan Hall and his navigation towards wholeness. Why this community and that community? Well, he looked at it and says, I mean, even the word wholeness basically says this, the whole is fitting together here. And in many ways, like stories of old, he deals with the literally me movie era. He deals with the cinema of self-righteousness, because of course you cannot blow apart. C.S. Lewis made this point again and again. You cannot blow apart the world with, even for Lewis, the earlier versions of postmodernity, and then make claims of good, bad, right, or wrong. They're just, there's no means by which to evaluate any claim. And so for like stories of old, well, we've sort of lost our way. Will we get it back?
Now, I realize this is all starting to sound a bit bleak, and especially for a channel that is specifically about the potential for and dynamics of conveying something meaningful through cinema, it's a future that doesn't look very bright. But keep in mind that this is just one hypothesis, and that while it may seem to forewarn some kind of fundamental collapse, it might just as well merely signify a temporary upset, a momentary lapse that is only going to remind us of what we actually want, what we actually need, and which in time will lead us back towards true nourishment. I have no doubt that balancing out our lives against this current phase of modernity is going to be one of the bigger challenges of our time, one that I can't possibly begin to pose a meaningful answer to. But still, I do have faith that, at least when it comes to the movies, all this is not going to be the absolute death of cinematic curiosity. Maybe it is true that new times require new perspectives on what the relationship between cinema and its audience can look like. Maybe there are some traditional ideals that we need to let go of, some new ones that we need to embrace. But then again, both the Brothers Karamazov and Moby Dick are still being read. Great thought-provoking movies are still being made and still being appreciated.
They're still being read, but they're not being written. In fact, it's from this video that he quotes Cormac McCarthy.
Observe that while people will apparently read mystery novels of any length, the indulgent 800-page books that were written 100 years ago are just not going to be written anymore, and people need to get used to that. If you think you're going to write something like the Brothers Karamazov or Moby Dick, go ahead, nobody will read it. I don't care how good it is or how smart the readers are. Their intentions, their brains are different. Blame the death of cinematic curiosity when it is in fact not that at all. Well, I think because for so many people today it can absolutely feel like it is. And they might want some understanding of why that is, and a reminder that it doesn't have to be that way. I know I did. For while it might seem like I wrote this video just to examine some broader cultural trends and maybe even to take a shot at some groups who aren't treating cinema as they should, in reality though, I made it just as much for myself. Because I too have been drawn in by and arguably grown to overvalue the comfort of relatability. I too have misused movies as an easy source for moral satisfaction, as a way to delude myself into believing I was a better person than I actually am. An issue which I've also explored in another video relating more specifically to masculinity and false ideals of the heroic self. And I too have been postponing so many movies that I know will actually offer something of value, to instead mindlessly settle for the cinematic equivalent of empty calories. And I wish I didn't.
But of course, he's doing all of this dead reckoning too. There is a hierarchy of ideals that he's weighing the world against, and there are assumptions about good, bad, right, and wrong that he is using to evaluate. And so the things get larger and larger and larger and larger, and so we're back to, in many ways, stories and going above and below the waterline. But what's tremendously helpful is always remembering that there is a waterline. That, in fact, as he said in the previous video, there is in order for the frame to work, and you cannot think without a frame. This is, the discovery of the frame problem. In order for the frame to work, you both have to see through the frame, but in a way, you also have to embrace the frame you're seeing through. And he's optimistic about cinema, but are there dead, or at least not really dead, displaced forms before? Because cinema isn't a given. The world lived for a very long time without cinema. It might seem that for previous generations, theater, like with a stage and an audience, theater isn't dead. Theater remains. Theater still has a quality that cinema cannot replicate. Cinema is going through a crisis, the same crisis that, again, we spoke about with respect to the AI conversation. And it could be, in fact, that, as I observed with that in the live stream, what it could mean is the not so much the death of the human, but the death of the machine. Because, humans aren't going to throw the machines away, but we're not going to use them perhaps in the ways that we use them now. And an example of that might be television. There are plenty of people who still watch over-the-air television. And if you visit a bad nursing home, you will see what cable television can do. I was visiting someone, I didn't know it would be the last time I would see her, or that would be her last day of living. But the TV was blaring for the woman in the bed next to her. There were 3 people in that nursing home. And the woman I was talking to was like, I can't, they won't turn that television down. And the woman laying in the bed next to her was sleeping soundly. And it's like, well, why would they have the TV on so loud for a sleeping woman? And then when the person I was visiting told me she screams all night, I figured out they probably have the TV on so loud to keep the woman asleep. Because it could be that for her, that bombardment of daytime TV noise works functionally as a drug. So Karen Wong had this great image at the Northwestuary where she was talking about the fact that what is it that you can't find the bottom of? And it might be hair, it might be paint, it might be cinema. And so for the priests that go back and forth behind the iconostasis, come out above and below the waterline, come out to, oh, here, let me explain this to you. Why would you need to explain it to me? Because unless I can put it in propositional, I won't appreciate it. I haven't seen the next Joker movie. I will probably see it when it comes out on live streaming. But I boldly go ahead and watch Byrne and Damien and anybody else with all of their spoilers. Part of the reason because I'll forget half the spoilers, but also because they help me watch the movie better. So when I sit down, and I think that's part of what's happening in this little corner, part of what's happening with these commentary videos, part of what's happening with the iconostasis of what's happening in this YouTube space. If it's dipping above and below the waterline, there is a transjective quality of that as well. Because all of our life we're going above and below the waterline. We do something. Why did I do that? And we bring it up here. And then it seeps down again. Back and forth behind. Where is it? Behind the iconostasis. As a preacher, part of me knows I cannot compete with Hollywood. Their temples are everywhere. The altars are in everyone's home. Set has long since, it's moved from one set in the living room to maybe a set in the living room and the bedroom, then a set in the living room and the bedroom, and then now a set in every pocket. And it's not just the guardians of our world that can control the gatekeepers that go on the set. We're all putting stuff on the set. And to a degree, he's right in that, well, this present crisis of movies will pass. He may not be right in that all that is lost can't be preserved. Because as Cormac As Cormac said, we don't have the same minds. The movies themselves, and you really get this sense watching older movies, even especially movies from the 70s, the movies themselves change because the movies are artifacts of who we are now. And of course, that we is sort of a modernistic, transcendent we, which obviously is nowhere near as universal as we used to imagine it was. But neither is it always as particular as we sometimes assert it is. Okay, that's it. Leave a comment.